Hello and welcome to Film Ireland Presents. I'm Gemma Creagh and I'm delighted to be joined by Ciarán Ó Cofaigh. He is a producer and founder of Rusk, and that's the production company behind Na Féilte Tine, which explores the 4 indigenous festivals of Samhain, Imbolg and Bealtaine. The episode on Samhain is available to watch on the RTE player now, and Imbolg will be available on the 3rd of February. Thank you so much for chatting with us.
It's great to have the opportunity to discuss it. Thank you very much.
Well, before we discuss this lovely series that I like, it's magical and it's beautiful and it's ethereal and such a sensory exploration, and I love the utilization of different forms, but we will absolutely get into this and the technical details and how it got across the line. But I'd really like to learn more about your journey first, and what drew you to the screen industries and what kind of keeps you creating work?
I think mostly I was always interested in film and TV, but who isn't, you know? Like it's the general public are so visually literate at this stage. We've been exposed to so much over the years. So I was naturally, I think, like most people, interested in TV and film. That which has driven me, or that which pushes me towards certain things, is the Irish language and culture. So I thought it was a way that I could pursue what I was interested in, but also do some good for the Irish language. Now, I don't want to come across as a martyr, but you need some reason as a producer to do what you do, because you're not going to do it for money. You know, you're not going to do it for love, or you just need a reason, and it doesn't matter what that reason is. For me, I thought I might be able to affect the Irish language in a positive way. And then when I was finishing in university, TG Ceathair was beginning, and I decided to apply. They were running a lot of training courses at the time. Now, you know, the way it happened was TG Ceathair was proclaimed to happen like in the late 80s or late 80s, I think the commitment would have been given. But it was 96 by the time it happened. So over that 5 or 6 year period, there were a lot of training courses to train Irish speakers in all fields. The first couple of training schemes were for producer directors, and I was lucky to get a place on the second one. RTE were responsible for the training, so we did a lot of single camera work here in Connemara, and we did a lot of studio work then in the training centre in RTE. That would have been the end of 1990, and for most of 90, I think it was a 9-month course between the jigs and the reels. So that's where I became interested, or maybe I was drawn to TG Ceathair, Irish language programming, the idea that this would happen. Now, we were waiting for many years then for it to happen. I had some interest in model making from before, and animation, so I became involved with an animation company for a while, and then we set up this company, Rusk, in 96.
Rusk as a company, what are the projects that you guys have done over the years? Because there's been such a plethora of informational documentaries, gorgeous drama, docudrama. Can you talk to me a little bit about like maybe your own process and the projects that you've taken on over the years, what they've looked like and how they've sort of shaped what you want to create?
Well, because our interest was mostly in the language and through that, the Gaeltacht area, we didn't really care about genre. I don't care. Like, for me, the point is always to do it as good, if not better, than English language programming. You know, playing the white man's game better than the white man is how I would say it as a reservation Indian. So, we have done a lot of drama. We've produced. We were involved with a short film scheme, Shield Scale, out of which came. There were 4 different where we were developing writers and directors but at different times. Like, this would be done over a year, and then at the end of it, there would be a production of 6 half-hour shorts. So there were 4 of them. 24 half-hour shorts. We had also produced three half-hour shorts ourselves. Our first one with Dervla Walsh in, when was that? 98 or earlier? I can't remember. 98
Wow.
actually.
Yeah.
Plus Anita. I think it was our first short as well. And of course, Dervla is brilliant and has gone on to do great work.
A
Um,
Handmaid's Tale. The was it Bad Sisters now?
Yeah, no, but
Like another
she was
season.
always I met her when I was doing the training in the training center. A lot of us then had the opportunity to do the odd job in the training center as camera or sound people or whatever. And I met her when I was doing some part-time work in there, and she was doing her own producer director's course. And she, from the beginning, she was obviously very talented. But anyway, so we 27 half-hour shorts. We produced features, Na Féilte, which is very much an art house film on the most respected modern novel in the Irish language from Martin O'Kine, on Na Cleigna, which was a supernatural thriller, although with strong connections to the fairies. We never mention the term fairy in it, but it is obviously connected to fairy folklore. And I don't mean Tinkerbell here. I mean like the dark Irish stuff. Unbronthenus, which is a big thriller about guys who find drugs and always do the wrong thing with it for the right reasons. That was a big production. What else? More recently, we've began to become interested in feature-length docudramas with Murder One Thrasna. Um, we did with Colm Barrett, which was very well received, and The Queen versus Patrick O'Donnell with Tomas Shoiga, which was all over the world at festivals. And now we're dealing with this series, Na Féilte Tine, and I probably missed some productions, but that's a general sweep. So, oh yeah, the Scale na Gaeilge on which you were working actually many, many years ago, which was a mixture of animation and real time. So, we don't really care what the genre is
Yeah.
as long as we can produce something of maybe cultural value, or I don't know how to say it without sounding like a dickhead, but something which is more about affecting some positive change. Now that can be a simple thriller like Unbronthenus, but through the Irish language, it's presenting the Irish language as a living language, and we're saying, well, you can have baddies and goodies in the Irish language, and it can be a drama, it can be real. So I think that is our motivation, mostly. And now Na Féilte Tine, in some ways, it's definitely not the biggest production we've been involved with, but it's probably the closest to my heart in that it connects to the to Irish tradition, Irish folklore, Irish myth, the importance of ritual and ceremony in our own culture. And it brings a spiritual aspect to it, which I think is appealing and may evoke something in the viewer.
It's really beautiful, but you're not off the hook yet because I'm going to ask you more questions about yourself first, and then we're going to dig into this because I think what you've described like an incredible plate, and you've worked with some talent that you've nurtured and worked with, and created a slate of projects that are gripping and modern, but so distinctly indigenous, which is very powerful. You are a creative producer, you are involved, your voice is there. I can even feel like just having seen some of the productions, like hear a little of your tone in the productions. Like they're watching this, like, like, and reading Scale or watching Scale na Gaeilge and listening to this, I can hear a little bit of a tone that I presume is your voice. It's like a humor, but like an enthusiasm that is sort of distinct. So I was just wondering if you could just talk to me about developing projects like this and what it takes to get them to the point where we even get to see them.
Different developmental periods for different projects. Some of them, like Téna Killia, happened very quickly. Some, like Na Cleigna, we were developing for 6 years before that happened. The most recent one, Na Féilte Tine, we've been developing for 5 years or so. But as a production, it was quite particular. Because so the series is basically about the four indigenous fire festivals or the cross-border festivals, the transition from one season to the next. Our new year begins at the beginning of November, begins with Halloween. That's the end of the old year. When I mean our, I mean Irish or Gaelic culture. So, and that begins the dark half of the year. And then there's a bright half of the year. Now, the darkness we refer to is not a bad darkness. It's just the natural order of things. It's a different time of the year. But again, I think the idea of cyclical time comes into it, that these things are rhythms, they're rhythmic. So in relation to the series, because there was a strong connection with the tradition, with folklore, and also it gave us the opportunity to go deeper into the Irish psyche. So getting back to the time frame, we would film when the festivals were happening. So we began our filming in April 23, and these were the core interviews we filmed. And then we would film at the so Bealtaine was the first, the beginning of May. Lúnasa was our second shoot, and then Samhain for Halloween, and then Imbolg of 24. This time last year was when, well, this the beginning of February last year was when our production ended. So it was a very extended production in itself. The production itself took around a year and a half, but 3.5 years of that was in development. Or development, like the truth is, development of the idea doesn't take that much time. It's getting the money is hustling is where the long periods in between decisions, which is the nature of it. Commission the film. If you're lucky to get support, you're waiting a long time to find that out. There are many stages to it, but thankfully it was relatively simple in that it was RTE, Commission the film, and Section 481. So each one is different, but the development for the Féilte Tine was approximately 3.5 years or so.
Wow. And it's so thoughtful and beautiful. In terms of, again, you've collaborated with so many people, and I'm going to dig down into it because I know you were writing it yourself as well. And again, all these ideas that you would have come up with. In terms of building the relationships that you collaborate with, those creative collaborations, and you have this idea that is so important and close. How do you find and trust the people that you work with? How do you know it's the right director or it's the right writer to get this on the page for you?
Well, most of the directors we've worked with, we had a relationship with, we've known, or like Colm Barrett, for example, he had been involved with two of the short films in the short film schemes that we ran. So the same with Dervla. He's very talented. He's very different personality, but clearly very talented. So I was, delighted to get the opportunity to work with Colm. The same with Thomas Shoiga, who worked with us on The Queen versus Patrick O'Donnell. Thomas was involved with the short film schemes.
And Dermot Goggins from Kin now.
Adams, of
He's
course,
great things.
on Scale McGuade, yeah. Diarmuid was also involved with those short film schemes. So that with Na Féilte Tine, we didn't. It was somewhat different in that mostly when I would be working with directors, they would be also involved with script, if not the script writers. On the Féilte Tine, it was more of a personal thing for me, and I was across the post production a lot more. I would be making a lot of the post production decisions. Well, Mary Crumlish, the editor, who did a great job, was doing them, but it was we were working together on those. So in this case, the directors we worked with were very good directors, but they were more field directors in the sense that I was giving them a brief and what they needed to it. So it was different to other projects. In other projects, the director would be closer to the script, if not the writer. And there'd be a lot of collaboration. But to tell you the truth, I think the biggest challenge as a producer is finding the right person for the job. But once you've made that decision, you just have to let them do what they do. From the Féilte Tine, it was somewhat different in that I was kind of across the narrative aspect a lot more and more central to the post-production side of things with the editor, Mary Crumlish.
The process of working with Rachel Moriarty in terms of prepping for this. So you spent a lot of time in development. You've been sitting with the ideas for a long time. You are working on the concepts and the scripts what stage does Rachel come on board?
Well, quite late, to tell you the truth. Once we're in production and we're planning on where we're going to film, what festivals, where we're going to get that, which is going to, this kind of work, it's not like in drama where you would structure your narrative in a certain way. For this work, I refer to it as narrative excavation. You want in a situation where the interviewees are going to tell the story. At least they're going to be doing the speaking side of the story. We did a lot of telling through other media, but you're basically trying to figure out what you want to say, and then you structure. Now, this is with a lot of conversations with the interviewees. I had many, many conversations with them, but once you have some idea as to where they're coming from, you're laying out the questions so you will get the aspects of your narrative structure that you want to tell. Now, again, there are times when new things arise and you go with that as well, but you're basically planning a narrative through a structure whereby questions will be asked and responses given, and then you're setting out your narrative. So the narrative was set through those interviews from the initial recording in April 23. And it was for the director, in this case for Rachel, it was really more about, we had a lot of conversation about what we wanted to say, but it was really more about the symbolic aspect of it, symbolically what we wanted to see visually, the people we would be speaking to, the kind of thing that we would expect them to say to us, and connecting that with the idea of Imbolg, of Brigid or Brigid as she's referred to, and how that presents the themes of Imbolg, but by going deeper because each program has a sub theme. In for Samhain, it's myth. For program one, it's myth. For Imbolg, which is upcoming, it's belief. For Bealtaine in 3 months' time, it is nature, the mother herself. And then for Lúnasa, it is celebration. So now each one of those sub themes are relevant for all festivals. It's just it was a door for us into how we wanted to explore that aspect of the Irish psyche and the reasons people come together. So it was having conversations like that with Rachel, but from Rachel's perspective, it was more a visual thing. She had a very good brief as to visually what we wanted to achieve, the kind of imagery we wanted to see, and she had background from the interviews as well that we had carried out. So yeah, like late enough, once I knew she would be available for Imbolg, I was delighted together because she's a great director, and she understood the brief very well. And then when I ended up dealing with the editor in post, it was all there, it was all there. That's not to say I didn't sweat over every single frame. Of course I did. Everything had to say something. And if it's not saying something, then it's of no use to that kind of narrative. Now, when I mean say, maybe evoke is the right word. Maybe evoke and as opposed to say. But every shot, every image, every symbolic representation had to be authentic within what we were doing. Because sometimes when you're dealing with this kind of programs, and it's the first time I've done this kind of spiritual program, arty type program in that sense, there's an awful lot of bullshit, in those worlds, and it's knowing what is bullshit and what isn't is, I think, the key to that, and that takes time to really explore, I believe. But anyway, like I said, back to Rachel, it was very much a visual brief she had, and she did a great job.
Brilliant. And actually, there's probably about four sub questions that are in very different directions. So I think I'll stick with the visuals for the moment. There's like in a reference for this, what would be your reference points? Would you come to her with like a lookbook and like other documentaries? Would it be hours and hours of discussion? Um, do you have a visual language? Then when the DOP comes on, or would what stage would they be brought on in terms of
The
building them?
POP would have been central to the telling. Trevor, he did a great job. But we had previously done rough cuts for Bealtaine and Lúnasa, which is where we began, just because of the schedule of everything. So at least I could present Rachel with a rough cut of Bealtaine, for example, before she filmed for Imbolg. So that was a good reference, but it would have been conversations. It would have been mood boards, as you call them, or representative imagery. But probably the best guide would have been the rough cuts, the previous rough cuts, of Belton in particular, which was at a fairly like we had decided to try and break the back of the post production in that we had to film at four different points of the year because that's when these things were happening. And so it was very extended. But we filmed after the initial interviews, the core interviews in April 23. We then went out to film the Beltane or the May celebrations, end of April, beginning of May. Then we went out again the end of July, beginning of August for the Lúnasa festivals. And then we went into a rough cut period to just get rough cuts from those two so that we could take some of the pressure off when we finished filming in February of 24. So we did have them as representative pieces, and they were probably the best guide for Rachel at that stage. But yeah, a lot of conversations. And when you're trying to represent the amness and the isness of things, it's never a literal, it's more metaphoric or mythic, or that's the kind of language we would be using anyway. Um, Symbolic language, the language of dreams in many ways.
To find the people to have those conversations. So you were saying like, yeah, you want to stay away from that. How did you reach out to that? Because I know again, having Irish language voices in this space is so important given the subject matter and the context. Would this be something you would have at writing stage? Would this be something that would be researched or would this be something that you'd already know and have that in mind as who you want to talk to?
There would be certain people, of course, like Pádraig Newlachan or Michael Harding or Manfred McGann, who would be targets, but a lot of research because we needed to cover many different aspects of what we wanted to say. So no, there was quite a lot, and a lot of academic people I didn't know, but I got to know through it, and just folklorists and people who weren't necessarily that academic, the Edwina Guckians of this world, those heroes, heroes. So it was great to get to know those people. And I didn't, we didn't know how necessarily, as I said, we had conversations, but we didn't necessarily know how they would respond to the questions when we were going through the interviews, but we knew the area they'd be coming from. We knew this was an aspect they'd be coming from. This would be an aspect they were coming from, and whether it was from myth, or whether it was from a more spiritual side of things, or on belief, or all those things that make up the psyche, the Irish psyche, those who had a strong connection with ritual and ceremony, and how important that is for people, that coming together, that resonance with certain times of the year. So we knew the areas they'd be speaking from, if not the specifics of what they'd be saying, if you know what I mean. But no, a lot of research, a lot of, and research is calling people, who do you know that would be good on such and such? Well, and we had many, many interviews with really interesting people, but not everybody ended up in the narrative because it wasn't hitting that narrative. So it's not, I think it was relatively planned and controlled, but you never really know. In general, I think you have a good idea how a person will respond and that they will be good. There's certain people that they'll be good. And then there are people you don't necessarily know, and but you think, well, maybe it'd be a good idea to speak to this person. And the interview is amazing. There's a lot of that happens. There's a lot of, I wouldn't say it's random because I don't think anything is, I don't believe in coincidences, but I definitely you can be pleasantly surprised sometimes with somebody who speaks and you're not really sure how they're going to respond. Not you know they're good speakers, but you don't know how what they're going to say is going to fall into the narrative.
Yeah. And in terms of, so something like this is so stylistic and like, are you like, and you're so well versed in this and you've done this a lot. But it's so stylistic that I'm sure it doesn't come together until all the, because it's so stylistic, because it's so based on pace and it's creative and artistic and has such a kind of language and a beat to it. Like, when you assemble the rough cut, like, and it takes a while to find that in the edit, but you assemble the rough cut. Like, did you ever get like just nervous? Do you ever go, oh, wait, do we have it? Do we have it? Like, it's there, you don't like, but is there any point where you just go,
You're always nervous. Like I wasn't nervous. I wasn't nervous that we didn't have the content.
yeah,
That's double negative. Anyway, I wasn't nervous about the content, but I suppose I was nervous about hitting those marks. Like there was I think, a very nice review written and there are a few nice reviews. But one of the nice reviews we had from the last broadcast from Samhain, like it was I won't get into the person who wrote it, but I think she wrote it well and it was very nice. But it begins with every critic or reviewer will always bring something into it. And it begins with, oh, presenting the idea, oh, cue a lot of hippie-ish purple prose. And it's the hippie-ish purple prose that we really wanted to avoid. Like we didn't want any, vague, bullshitty, spiritual, blah, blah, blah. It had to be coming from an authentic place. And that's what I was nervous about, having that, because I've had issues with cancer in recent years, and I was an ardent atheist before that, but I have had some experiences spiritually. So I've had a few years from my own personal perspective, of trying to cut through that bullshit. Um, and thankfully, I had that training, if you want to call it that, to cut through the bullshit here so that we're not, whatever is said, even if it's an opinion, is coming from an authentic place or is coming from the tradition. Or, like you said, is coming from a philosophical approach or whatever that may be. And it's valid. Like we had many great speakers, but for example, we had a philosopher called Bernardo Kastrup, who was very good to come over to be interviewed. He's based in the Netherlands. I'd kind of slightly met him a couple of times on online things. Um, and like, in the world of philosophy, this guy is a rock star. Like he's had a major influence on my life. So these are and the Michael Harding, Pádraig Newell, on Brigid on Mary Condren, who is the authority on Brigid or Brigid. The section in the Imbolg program from Women's Spirit Ireland. I think that's very interesting, and that's so. It's about being authentic and cutting through the bullshit. That was where I was mostly nervous about it. Now, people can accept it or not. I'm not saying that, it has to be seen as the absolute truth, if there even is such a thing. But the people who spoke from an authentic place, spoke from a considered place. And that's what I was nervous about. So we were ruthless when it came to that stuff. Yeah, myself and Mary Crumlish in the edit. Yeah.
and in terms of, finally putting those pieces together, and I think the sound mix is just stunning.
Mm.
At what stage do you bring music composition into this? At what stage, like, do you have kind of ideas for audio mixes in mind to like highlight certain things, or is that something that's found as you work through the process?
There are certain things that you would have in mind. Sean McErlane, the musician, did a brilliant job, but he was attached from the beginning. He had the perfect background, I think, to work on a project like this. Um, I'd say that we for example would have there's a term for it, a kind of what do you call it, cheat sheet or something. We would have pointers as to the themes connected to each program. and everyone would receive that as a guide. But like I was saying before, once you've chosen the person, then it's really for them to. Now, things come up in conversation. I know um, with Paul Rowland, who did a great job on the sound and the sound design and sound mix, we would speak about how we could represent certain things through sound because we knew from the beginning that these programs would not be literal tellings of anything. It wasn't like previous docudramas where this thing happened, this thing happened. This was not literal at all. Our aspiration was to evoke something in the viewer, which is why we there are people speaking using literal language, but we also rely a lot on poetry, on dance, on the imagery, the imagery, the camera work, sound, music. Even within the sections we were doing, the symbology, this symbology, is there even such a thing, such a word? The symbolic representation of certain things, like the Brigid's crosses, were a visual aspect of the telling. And because of the cultural background of most of the people, I presume, who'd be watching it, we were hoping that we could evoke something in them, evoke something, and even on a universal level, I think, not just an Irish level, we are talking about fundamental symbolic language. And I would agree completely with what Jung would have to say about the shared unconscious. I wouldn't use the term unconscious. I think that's a bad term, but because nothing is unconscious. But I do believe that we have a shared connection through our history and our past and the myth and the importance of myth, and how I really now have come to believe that there's probably more truth in myth than in any literal telling of anything. It's just a question of seeing what it metaphorically is saying. For example, Jung would have argued that because we know this, or at least we've come to understand it a lot in recent times, as Homo sapiens, we've been knocking around for 200 or 250,000 years, but 30 to 50,000 years ago, there was some shift in language and symbolic use of imagery, painting on caves, like to represent something symbolically that isn't the thing itself. That's basic stuff for us. But that was a massive shift. We seem to have gone from being self-aware to being also metacognitive, to have thoughts about thoughts. Now, the myth that explains this in many cultures, not just in Christian culture, is the myth of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, eating from the tree of knowledge, becoming aware of their naked state. Now, I don't believe that actually happened, but I believe the myth that was created to explain to ourselves the shift that has happened to us carries a lot of truth to it. And Jung, for example, would argue that it's through the interpretation of myth that we can come to the truth. And Jung and Freud, when they spoke about myth or mythic stories or these myths that influence cultures, that it really is about the internal struggle. That the monsters in the myth are really the monsters, our own dark side or shadow side. So, bringing all of that together to evoke through imagery, poetry, song, dance, the literal language is to support that. We want people to come from these after seeing these things with a feeling as opposed to knowing a list of facts, because there are no facts. And when it comes to these things, in a sense, like you can't say, oh, well, the festival was authentic in 1650. Like the festivals have been happening for thousands of years. For example, the group that we feature, Woman Spirit Ireland, Mary Condren and Leah and that crowd, um, that is a representation of a living culture that is rooted in the tradition, but has been brought to contemporary use or contemporary benefit through ritual and ceremony. So it's a living culture that needs to adapt as long as it's rooted in the tradition, I think it needs to do that because there is no one time that it was right. You know, it's right today. It was right 3,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago or whenever these traditions began. It's hard to know.
And I think it captures some of the magic that's underpinning it. I think we're always so quick in society, like to pin things down and have them be so literal and this is explained, but actually, like it captures in a very tangible and non like woo-woo way, like the wonder of communication and what this means for of a society, sort of what has been lost with colonization massively, and that impact on maybe our connection with nature and our own selves, and like and that shift in spirituality and what that means. And I think it just brings up so many questions that are open-ended and aren't answered while being such a beautiful visual experience as well. So I heartily recommend this. And one of the like and just again like casting such an eye on our own background, but yeah, just yeah, I think you are left sort of moved. Like my instinct watching this was to send it to my sister-in-law who's Mexican to go like, look how similar our cultures are. Actually, if you go way back when, like this is all rooted in something that's like much deeper than Catholicism or Christianity. That's but has taken similar but different shapes as it's evolved culturally, which
Yeah, no, I really believe that there is a universal mind. We are localized versions of that universal mind. And I also believe that these ceremonies, these rituals, these festivals at certain points of the year are really about oneness, about the interconnectedness of all things. You know, the falling away of that false sense of separation. In modern society, we're all individuals and it's my whatever, it's my car, it's my house, and you know, but really what these festivals and rituals, I think, bring us to is that sense of oneness, that interconnectedness with each other, that falling away of the false sense of separation, and how much that resonates with the person, and how little of that we experience these days, which, you know, it's about, Mary Condren says it very well in the Imbolg program. She speaks about, and I'm paraphrasing, but she says, the four festivals or the four fire ceremonies are about alignment. Alignment with the cosmos because they're happening at a certain time of the year, at a certain time of cosmological change between the seasons. Alignment with the community. Are you supporting or working against the community? And alignment with the body. And I think it's all about the oneness of things and the interconnectedness of all things. And that's what these festivals remind us of. You know, it's people talk about being in the zone or in flow. That's for me is just oneness.
and what do people have to look forward to? What are the huge questions? I mean, you talked in the broad terms, but what are sort of some of the kind of more intricate themes that will be explored in the next ones? Because I'm looking
Well,
forward
there's
to that.
still the well in you mean after Imbolg or
Yeah.
yeah, well Bealtaine, which is the end of April, beginning of May, which is the next turning point. Now, for some reason in modern society, things are different. But for us, for the Irish, traditionally, spring begins at the beginning of February. Summer begins at the beginning of May, and autumn or harvest, really, because the word we use for autumn is the same word for harvest, fover, begins at the beginning of August. Now, it's not quite the same, like spring begins later, but I think it's really about that modern thing is about people want to feel that it's spring when they say it's spring, but there has to be a beginning and an end to everything. So, but they're so clearly defined between the solstice and the equinox points anyway. They are the cross quarter points. And traditionally in Northern Europe, at least, that has always been the case. So for us, it's really about um, for example, Samhain, which is the beginning of our new year, and Imbolg is the dark half of the year, although it's spring in Imbolg. It's a kind, you know, it's the welcoming the new light. And then by the time we hit the beginning of May for Bealtaine, it's an explosion of life and of color and nature. So in Bealtaine, it's really about nature and that explosion of life and the bees and the butterflies and nature. And then Lúnasa, in August, it's about celebration. In many ways, Lúnasa is best represented in modern times by the electric picnic. That's what Lúnasa was, really. It was these big, festivals and fairs where animals might be sold, but it was really about action and women and men meeting because we had a tough enough life if you go back to the centuries from basically Imbolg, you were working and you were working hard, and if you didn't, you wouldn't be eating. So, but Lunasa was this big celebration of these are my livestock because you had got to the first phase of the harvest, and you knew I'm not going to die of starvation. So then you could you could go around and check out what's happening locally, go to another village at a festival, meet some woman, meet some man, whatever. And that's what Lunas is about in many ways. It's about the celebration of the harvest and that kind of the work is not over because the harvest goes on until the end of October. But so Beltana maybe from a nature perspective is really about nature and the explosion of summer and of life. And Lunasa is about gratitude and celebration at the harvest, at harvest time.
Thank you so much. That is like, it's just wonderful. It's just, I mean, the first two, absolutely gorgeous. And I cannot wait to watch the next two. So you've created something really wonderful.
Oh, me and many others. But thank you very much, Gemma. I'm very grateful for the opportunity.
Brilliant. And thank you so much for chatting with us. Hopefully, you'll be back soon talking about the next exciting one.
Sure. Beltana.
And thank you so much for listening. So make sure to never miss another podcast and subscribe to our newsletter over at filmireland.ie.